Hi Saw fans, I'm Emma and Emma loves horror, and I particularly love Saw, so I was absolutely gassed that I got to go and see Saw X in the theatres last week, and I'm ready now to give my review. There will be spoilers ahead in my review for not only Saw X but possibly for other films in the franchise, so if you haven't watched them all, maybe go and have a quick movie marathon. It will only take about, I don't know, 15 hours. Now, I have to preface this review with the fact that I am a massive Saw fan. Saw is my favourite horror franchise, not because all of the entries are fantastic, I don't think that they are, but the soap opera feel to it, the inventiveness of the original story and the complexities of the characters, I find really compelling. I always come back to it again and again and again, and of course I absolutely love the gore, which on the whole is done very, very well, with the exception of maybe Saw 3D and the pink blood fiasco. Saw X is the 10th movie in the franchise, and somehow it's one of the best. Saw X has absolutely no right to be as good as it is. I was absolutely blown away by it. I loved it immediately. I fell in love with it. When it finished, I was just beaming and was just so overjoyed that this was a great Saw film. That's what it is. It's a great Saw film. And I didn't have much hope for there being another good Saw film or a great Saw film after Saw 3D and then Jigsaw, and then Spiral's not really a Saw film, but it is because it's a spin-off, and I liked it, but it's not great. But Saw X is a great Saw film. I think it has flaws, but admittedly not many, which is saying a lot. It was clearly made with love and for the fans. It was thought out in terms of the Saw lore. There was some interesting character work, particularly with John and Amanda, which is hard to do when these characters are so established and people have spent years crafting their own relationships and takes and headcanons on these characters. And then with the new characters, we got a surprising amount of development for quite a lot of them. The traps were great, the effects were great. Overall, it was really well made, and it was a very good take on the saga and the franchise, and they did a lot of really smart decisions to make this movie feel fresh while still keeping to the root of the story. If anything, it feels like a return to form, a return to the, well, it is literally in the timeline a return to the original, but it really feels that way, which is impressive because it's made 20 years later. And the other big surprise is that the critics loved it. That's never happened. That has never happened. 85% or something like that on Rotten Tomatoes. Unheard of. Saw 1 got 50%, and that's the best of the critic reviews for the Saw franchise. I was really surprised, and it made me even more excited to go and see the film when I saw that the critics had actually enjoyed it, and I can see why they did. So behind the scenes we have Kevin Greutert as the director and the editor. Kevin had edited many of the Saw franchises prior to him becoming the director and taking the helm for Saw 6, one of the better sequels, and Saw 3D, one of the worst. I think it was a really smart choice to go with Kevin for this installment. He knows the franchise, he's been involved for a very long time. He understands how these movies are supposed to look and supposed to feel, even with the advances that we've made in technology, even with the increased budget. This movie had a budget of 13 million. The original Saw only had 1.2 million. Saw 4 was about 4 million, and then 3 through about Jigsaw were about 10 million. I think the only exceptions were 7 and Spiral, which were about the 20 million mark, which just shows that the extra money doesn't always go a long way. I do feel like you can feel the extra budget in this one in a great way. I feel like it was the choices that were made directorially and in the editing and in the cinematography by Nick Matthews were all really smart. The movie feels really, really slick. It feels polished, it feels elevated, but at the same time it still feels like a Saw film. We still get into those gritty sequences, we still have the montages that we're familiar with, we still have the the flash editing, which all just brings us back to that original feel that Saw had when it was much lower budget. I think a lot of the pieces really came together with this in terms of the costume design, the set design, the special effects were incredibly well done. I didn't really have any complaints in that department. Everything looked beautiful, which is a weird word to use for a Saw film, but it did. It really did look beautiful, so especially some of the landscapes that we get earlier on. They really took advantage of the Mexico setting that we got, and it was filmed in Mexico, and we really did get to feel like we saw it. And there is such a stark gorgeous contrast between the first half of the film and the second, when John is feeling all this hope and all this wonder and cherishing his own life, and then all of a sudden everything goes to pot and he puts these people into these traps. On the writing team, we've got Pete Goldfinger and Josh Stolberg, who also wrote Jigsaw and Spiral. This is definitely their best work, script-wise, for the Saw franchise. These guys also both did Piranha as well, Piranha 3D and 3DD, if anyone's seen those. They're incredibly funny, incredibly gory movies, and I do recommend them. Pete and Josh's script is really tight. Considering it's the longest movie in the franchise at pushing 2 hours, it does feel tight. The movie never feels slow. The build-up feels very intentional. The pacing worked really well for me. The introduction of the traps at certain points, the introduction of the characters at certain points, the development we got around those characters, the breathing room after the gore, it all felt very deliberate. It felt cohesive. And there was enough of the Saw lore in there to appease diehard fans, but at the same time, it wasn't too inaccessible to newer viewers, which I think was really clever, since you only really needed to have seen Saw 1 and 2 to fully enjoy Saw X, I think. On the music side, we have Charlie Clouser, who's returned again for his 10th film. I am so glad that he still wants to be part of this franchise and keep composing scores for it, because his score is so iconic to the franchise at this point. I don't think that any Saw film would really feel like a Saw film without Charlie Clouser. I think it's interesting that Charlie Clouser has done the music for Dead Silence and for The Collection. Dead Silence is another James Wan, and The Collection feels very Saw inspired. If you're looking for a franchise that's kind of similar, The Collector and The Collection, it's just a 2-part series, but they're very gory, and they have traps in the same sort of ilk as Saw. I also really appreciate that it's still Twisted Pictures that are producing these movies, and that are still the production company behind it. And I liked that Lionsgate brought back their Red Gears logo at the beginning. It's such a small detail, but just seeing that before the credits even start to roll, just brings me back in. It makes me feel like I'm watching the original franchise again. Okay, so let's get into the plot. So this is only the third movie in the franchise to not open with a trap. It opens with an MRI, and this felt to me a bit like a parallel to the opening of Saw 4, where we begin with John's autopsy. The framing of it is quite similar, and seeing his head going and in that machine, in that kind of medical environment, as opposed to the autopsy where we have his head with his throat slashed. It's a really good way of showing us that this time, because his eyes are awake, that we're diving into John's perspective. And we've never done that before. It's exciting. It's interesting. My favourite in the whole franchise has been Saw 2 for a very, very long time. And a massive reason for that is because John is such a main character. It's the first time that we actually really get to know him and start to understand him, start to get this sense of his ethos and who he is and why he is the way he is. So it's a brilliant choice to finally make him the actual protagonist, because even in Saw 2, he's the antagonist. We're following Eric Matthews. But this time, he's our star. And the strange thing is, we are rooting for him this time. They set it up in such a wonderful way. The cancer diagnosis that he has, his uncertainty, his doubts, the emotions that he's going through, the cancer support groups that we see early on, that we almost forget for a moment that John Kramer is Jigsaw. We know he's Jigsaw. We've seen it for 8 out of 9 films. But this time it really feels like his humanity is much more on display. I know that because of Jigsaw's moral code, some people would argue that that's his humanity coming through. We do see glimpses of it, with his relationships that he has with other people, and we see it in his reactions to the negative experiences he's had in his life. We do see that emotional side of him come out, even if it's not always in healthy ways. But this time, he does feel vulnerable in a way that he's never really felt before. Even when we were watching him go through horrible things in the past, it was never us really seeing him as a vulnerable character, as whether this time we really do. The first hint that's almost a reminder of this really being a Saw film is when we get the dream sequence of the eye trap. I think this is how to do a dream sequence in a Saw film. Saw 3D did an absolutely horrible dream sequence. That is one of my least favourite parts of the entire film. This makes sense as a dream sequence. We see someone do a bad thing, and then we immediately see how John imagines him putting this person into a trap and how he would punish them appropriately for the crimes that he's committed. And then when the man decides to make the right choice and put the put the things that he was about to steal from that patient back away. You know, John says, good choice. So we're again seeing that, you know, he feels his moral judgment is, you know, the law is the code. I do think it's interesting that that's immediately where John's mind goes, that implication that he doesn't ruminate on it for that long. It's just a bad thing has happened, therefore sword trap. But what is really interesting about this trap is it isn't designed to kill the participant on failure. I mean, having your eyes sucked out of your head doesn't sound pleasant, but the two options are different kinds of maiming, and it's definitely still torture. But it doesn't actually result in the person's death if they fail their task. So I think that's interesting that that's where John's mind goes first. And I wonder if other traps, he thinks of them in that way first and then almost finds a way for the participant to be killed at the end if they fail, which is, it just has interesting implications. The plot then really starts to get going when John re-meets his friend Henry, who is in his cancer support group. And he's miraculously cured of his cancer, which was stage 4. As soon as we saw Henry in the cancer support group, because I'd seen the trailer, because I knew where the movie was going, I immediately was like, no, plant, I don't believe in you. Surprise, surprise, I was right, but I don't think I'm going to be alone in that at all. You can see how John was convinced. Big scar that he has, him suddenly being better, his explanation that the reason he hasn't talked about this treatment is because it was illegal. John believed it because he wanted to believe it. It's not like John to not thoroughly research. We see implications of the research, but it does seem like because of the connections that John has and the resources that he has, we see even later on in the same movie that Amanda is able to go back and find all of the people that have been through Cecilia's treatment, and she knows that none of them were ever cured. It feels like that was the sort of thing that John would have done before he tried to get into the treatment. But they do make a good point of condensing the timeline so that as soon as he reaches out to Cecilia, you know, she wants him in immediately. So this sense of haste, I can overlook the kind of logic of it and just accept, okay, yeah, you know, he wants this so badly. He's so full of hope for this idea working. He's so desperate to live. He's got such a will to live that he goes with it on the off chance. I also think it's interesting that this might be the cancer treatment that John is asking for coverage of in Saw 6. Cecilia Peterson is from Norway, which is where this experimental treatment that John is asking for in Saw 6 is also from. So John travels to Mexico. He travels alone and he meets Diego, the taxi driver. Diego shows him around, drops him off at the center where he's threatened at gunpoint and then shoved into the back of a van, and you could see John is visibly scared. And I think it's the first time we really see John scared in that sense. I mean, he's been scared before, you know, when we, you know, see him get his cancer diagnosis and stuff, and when he's talking about his cancer diagnosis and the fact that he might die, as whether this he actually looks scared, he looks frightened, and you think, oh no, this poor old man, which is nuts. He's a serial killer. He gets to this facility and he meets Cecilia Peterson, who is the doctor that is supposedly going to cure his cancer. And we meet the other players as well. Gabriela, who is an assistant who has supposedly been cured by the treatment by the Peterson Foundation before herself and is taking care of John as a guest. And we have Mateo, who is not really an anesthesiologist, and Valentina, who is not really a nurse. We see this absolutely gorgeous complex. We meet Carlos as well, who is a young boy who's playing, and John decides to fix his bike. It's nice to see these touches of John's engineering background kind of played out in this very simple way, and John's interaction with a child, which seems quite precious, again juxtaposed against the realities of who this person is. John is an absolute nightmare. The idea of your child spending time with him is horrific, but the interaction they share is genuinely quite sweet. Then we meet Parker, who is there with a patch across his throat because he's supposedly just had the surgery on his thyroid cancer, which Cecilia has now cured. I think a lot of people have said that they found the twist reveal later in the film quite easy to spot, because I also was looking at Parker and went, right, plant in on it. It's done in a way that you could maybe have believed that he was another dupe. I don't think it was done well enough to push me into thinking that way. It all felt too convenient. Then we have the treatment itself. The way that they go about it with keeping John awake but in and out of consciousness, I think is clever. Rather than them saying, oh, we're just going to put you to sleep, it creates just such an extra layer of sadisticness to this plan, that he really is there for all that time while they pretend to perform a surgery on him. I think it was a really horrible sequence to watch, just how sinister these people are to be doing this to a cancer patient who they have no idea is John Kramer. Afterwards, we then see John in his move for recovery. Cecilia's still playing along. He's saying he's going to pay the rest of what he's going to pay, and we see him appreciating the world around him. I love that he goes to go and get tequila to go and give back to Gabriela because he felt a genuine connection with her. I also love that moment in the park where we see him drawing the rack. It was just such a nice moment of humour of, oh, John's in his happy place now. He can go back to just designing saw traps and torturing people as he is wont to do. Ah, good for him. I also really loved the touch, again, with the engineering of him using the landscape and mapping the angles in order to relocate the place where he was so that he can give the tequila back. He goes through so much effort just to get this bottle of tequila to this girl. But then obviously when he goes back, he realizes that this was all a scam, that none of it's real, that he was never operated on at all. And although we knew as the audience that this was coming, Tobin Bell sells this moment so well. This whole sequence, he sells it so much. We feel absolutely devastated for him. It's just so upsetting, and we know immediately as soon as this happens where we're going next. And now we know we're going to get into some good stuff, but unlike many other franchise installments before this one, we know who's going in the trap before they're in the trap. We know why they're going in the trap before they go in the trap. And we know that they are horrible. What they've done is awful. And so there's part of us that completely understands John's motivation for revenge. So when this moment comes, we're almost like, yes, okay, yeah, let's go. And then we get these fun sequences of John preparing for the game. We get these little nods to Hoffman where he's on the phone and he says, hello, detective, I need your help, which wouldn't alienate any people who have no idea who Hoffman is, but is there for the die-hard Saw fans to go, oh yeah, I know who's on the phone too. This all helps with the logic of this. Then we have Diego's game. And Diego is the taxi driver and he was in on the scam. John figures this out and he's the easiest for John to find again in Mexico. So he puts him in the pipe bomb trap. There's been so much build up to this point. It must be about an hour in that we actually get this trap. And it's so good. It's a really good trap. The cutting out of the arm, the way it's shot is very visceral. It feels very real. Generally, I haven't liked it when bombs have been used in the franchise. I just think it's a little bit, I don't know. It's just not as inventive as some of the other stuff that we've seen, but it's a bit different this time when it's attached to a person, kind of like how it was for William Easton in Saw 6, where they're on his hands and he has to get each of them off. This feels like a kind of precursor to that, where it's the whole game is getting these things off, and it's gross, and you can see why Diego is absolutely terrified. He's already been tortured at this point before he actually gets put in the trap, and then he actually starts to tell Jigsaw everything. Then I thought at this point that we would jump straight into the game, but we don't. There's this sequence where we see a bit of the realities of all of these scammers, and for a couple of them, it just edges you into their favour a little bit, just a smidge. We see Valentina and we see that she's actually a sex worker. Likewise with Gabriela, who is suffering from addiction. That was really interesting just to just pepper that layer in, that while we think of this scam as being something that's orchestrated by everyone in equal measure, especially from John's perspective, there are layers to these characters which make their motivations a little bit different from each other. It affects our empathy later on when we're watching the traps. We also have a great sequence of each of these characters being captured, which we find out then is by Amanda. My favourite one being Cecilia Peterson herself. It feels like that she's absolutely terrified in her own home when she starts hearing things and then she sees the pig on her roof. Brilliant, loved it. So then finally we have all the players ready to begin their game. And this is when we introduce Amanda to the story. I think it was a really good decision to bring her in here. We've allowed for so much time with John, and now we bring in Amanda. And I think it's really interesting to see Amanda at this point between Saw 1 and Saw 2, when she is really fledgling, you know, just out of the reverse bear trap. This is a really good era of Amanda. This is when she was very popular as well in the franchise, and I think that the movie was trying to capitalize on that popularity of the character at that point before it gets to that Saw 3 version of Amanda. What's especially interesting is how in this game, John and Amanda are directly involved. They are there, they are watching, they are talking to the players directly. There are still cassette tapes, there is still Billy, but for the most part, it's about John and Amanda, and they deliver the instructions or deliver pointers, etc., and they intervene. I think it was really interesting to see Amanda, when everything's getting set up, especially for the first game, trying to encourage them almost, saying, you know, you can do it. I believe in you, because she's been through this and she wants to believe in the method. She wants to believe in what John does, and he's becoming such a father figure to her. It's a self-fulfilling validation of, if these people get out and they're better, then that means I'm better. At least that's how I interpreted it. So the first game we have is Valentina's Trap, which is the jiggly saw or giggly saw trap. This reminded me of both the foot sawing of the original Saw. I think it was great that the first trap that we actually see in this particular game with these 4 players is a saw trap, literally. It reminds me a bit of that, yeah, like I say, of Lawrence Gordon cutting off his own foot in Saw 1, and the saw at the neck with the decapitation threat reminds me of the necktie trap from Saw 5. So it all seems like there's some kind of threads and parallels in a lot of the traps being used here, kind of like early iterations of stuff that we later see. This trap is one of the best traps in all of Saw history. It's just disgusting. Oh my god, it was squirming in my seat, eyes glued to the screen, couldn't look away, horrifying. Wow. It's simple, but it's really, really effective. I was really rooting for Valentina to escape, and she was so close that just the fact that it was just seconds out was really brutal, and I felt cheated almost. I was annoyed at Jigsaw. I was like, oh, come on, she did it. She was so close. Like, it just takes time to get the marrow out of your thigh, obviously. It was really sad. It makes sense that she failed just to make the threat more real for the other players at that point. I don't know how massively well-known Jigsaw is in this time period. I mean, at the time of Saw 1, Lawrence Gordon had heard of him, but Adam hadn't. So it's possible that he's not as well known yet as a serial killer, especially since they're in Mexico, because Jigsaw's never operated in Mexico before or since, as far as we know. So it's unlikely that they would have had a huge amount of knowledge. We find out later on that Cecilia did know about Jigsaw and the idea of the serial killer, and she figured it out. But that does explain why Cecilia is so immediately encouraging. As we see later on, she doesn't really care if these people live or die, but her being encouraging, I think, is her kind of showing Jigsaw that there's an element of respect, that she kind of enjoys this sadism in the same way that he does when it's not happening to her. So I think it does make sense that Valentina fails her trap and dies, and that we got to see all of the trap, because she doesn't go, no, I can't, and then just to get decapitated. She does saw off her leg, she does stick the tube in, it's super gross, and then she just still fails at the end, and seeing her body just flop onto the floor is pretty gnarly. But not as gnarly as what happens next, where Cecilia pretty much immediately just goes, oh yeah, great, now we've got some rope, get those intestines out. But I did think, again, fun parallel to Saw 1, where Amanda is pulling through the intestines of her cellmate in order to get the key for the reverse bear trap. Just the contrast in how easy Cecilia found that to do, to make that decision to just jump in and take out those intestines like it was nothing, to get the others to join her in order to get the phone, as opposed to Amanda, who was literally in a time-sensitive trap at the time and clearly finding it so terrifying and so emotionally horrific. I do think it's really smart that Cecilia gets the phone. Obviously, we get the reveal later that this was all planned, and that does make sense because it did seem odd when they left the phone so clearly in the middle of the game where all these people could see it and know it was there. You could argue it was just it's just to taunt them sort of thing, but I think it seemed pretty obvious that that was going to be something important. Cecilia makes a phone call. She calls, we don't know exactly who at the moment, but we find out later that it's Parker that she calls. And so then Parker shows up, saying that he's there for Cecilia as well to get his money back because he was duped by the scam and has realised the same things that John Kramer has. He ends up tied up in the room where he can then watch the rest of the game unfold. Amanda and John are quite cagey with him. They're acting quite strangely towards him. I think it felt fairly obvious that they knew that he was involved in the scam and that they were toying with him, especially as they say to him things like, the rules are simple, this is your own test. The implications there, Jigsaw doesn't put innocent people in traps, and if he really thought that Parker was just a man who'd been screwed out of however much money as he had, then he wouldn't have put him in this position necessarily. But then again, Jigsaw's ethos and his mythology and his moral code go haywire throughout the series, so I also wouldn't be that surprised if he was just like, whoop, better do some blackmail. The interactions between Jigsaw and Amanda are so interesting throughout this bulk of this game. We get so much more insight into their relationship because this is at a time when Jigsaw and Amanda's relationship is really good, is really strong, is really positive. Well, in the context, as positive as it could be, and in comparison to how badly it goes. Obviously, this is a relationship where there is a huge power imbalance. John is completely taking advantage of Amanda and is manipulative, and she is so vulnerable and so desperate for his approval and his validation and his love. It's a very twisted relationship, but in their eyes, this is when it was good. Their interactions are really interesting. We see flashes of the different aspects of Amanda's character. We see her own ethos and how it contrasts sometimes with John's. We have flashes of her dark side and her stubbornness, when John says, right, Gabriela's next, and she's like, no, actually, Mateo's next. Screw you. I liked that they had that kind of back and forth, and John was shown to sometimes respect her opinion and sometimes not, and likewise whenever she goes to him, she sometimes stands up to him, but sometimes she comes much more kind of submissive puppy. I think Shawnee Smith did a incredible job really capturing those different flavors without kind of going really ham in one direction and then the other. It felt really, really balanced and really measured. I was really impressed. So then we get into Mateo's trap, which is the brain surgery trap. And again, we get so many trap parallels in this one. I love it. So this reminded me of Saw 3 with John's brain surgery. And visually, it reminded me of Kerry's trap, actually, with the key dissolving in the acid, with the brain lump that has to go into the enzyme and dissolve. Visually, that was what I was getting from it. This trap felt really personal. He is replaying essentially the video of the brain surgery that they used to trick him, and he's telling him, yep, you gotta cut some of your brain out. So easy, huh? A really gnarly sequence. It's pretty gross. The microtome cutting of the skull piece looks really painful, but I do think it wasn't as impactful just because when we did see this in Saw 3 with the backdoor brain surgery, we were using a power drill and a circular saw. It felt so gritty, as whether the microtome is just a tiny surgical tool. It still looks really painful and it's still a great trap, but it doesn't feel quite as brutal as that Saw 3 sequence did, even though that was actually a medical procedure and this is a trap. This also reminds me a little bit, this trap, of the Saw 2 death mask. Just this idea of this thing closing around your face, especially since it has a mask on the outside, the Mayan mask that is reminiscent of the statue that Diego shows them earlier on in the film. I'm not sure why the Mayan mask was used specifically for Diego, for Mateo even. I don't know. I think maybe this trap was intended for Diego in a first draft maybe, and then they just kept it because they were like, oh, it's cool. I do know that you don't actually have any nerves in your brain itself, so the sequence of him actually just rummaging around in there is more psychologically horrifying than it would be physically, she says, as if she's done it. And then again, like Valentina, we have a failure within absolute seconds of it happening, but I wasn't as sad about Mateo dying. I was kind of like, yeah, burn them up, woo. One of the most interesting relationships in the film is the relationship between Amanda and Gabriela, because Amanda sees something of herself in Gabriela. She realizes that Gabriela is an addict, that she's suffering with addiction, and that's why that she got swept up in Cecilia's game. I think it's really interesting how she presents this to Jigsaw. She's very tentative about it at first. She gets a little bit more insistent. She starts quite openly helping Gabriela. You know, she lets John know, no, I'm pushing her game back. John can probably hear Amanda saying to Gabriela, like, please just listen to the rules. I want you to live. I want you to get out of this. I thought it was a really nice thing to see Amanda have that emotional connection to a victim, particularly because, you know, when we see her in Saw 2, she's getting revenge herself against Eric Matthews, and then in Saw 3, she is in full I'm making unwinnable traps and everyone deserves to die mode. So this is really different. I don't think we've ever seen Amanda put someone in a trap herself who she wants to live. And then we have Gabriela's game. It's not as memorable as the first two traps in this game, which I think is maybe intentional. I think it's maybe from the perspective of Jigsaw that he didn't give her as horrific a trap, possibly because he also saw something of Amanda and Gabriela and felt that kind of connection, and felt that there was more hope for her. And he's even encouraging, and, you know, your skin can be grafted and your bones will heal, just, you know, get through it and you'll be fine. But the radiation is pretty horrible. Her skin literally is melting off her face. I think why Jigsaw is so much more insistent than Amanda that Gabriela needs to be in this game, needs to be in these traps, is because he felt the most personally hurt by Gabriela. She was the one that he was getting the tequila for. She was the one that was actually kind of looking after him on the day-to-day. He put a lot of his kind of fatherhood projections onto her. Even though Cecilia is the one who set all this up, it felt like that the betrayal really came from Gabriela, and I think that's why the tequila was so important. She breaks her leg, swings out of the way, and then when the radiation machine moves to put her back in the fray, I was so gutted. I was really upset. I was like, no! She was being, you know, she was taking sadistic Cecilia's advice to swing out of the way. I don't see how she wouldn't have been out of the way, though, if she'd done her hand first and dropped to the floor. I mean, the radiation machine probably would have come down, but it'd be much easier for her to, like, run around and escape it on the floor, I think. But hey-ho, could just be Cecilia being like, ha ha ha, die. I don't know. She's mean. So then she's still in the trap, but she does get through it and she survives. And it makes sense that she's the one that survives, who makes it out of her trap, especially after we've had two so close calls. I don't think we could have had the third one just die at this point, especially with the emotional build-up that we've had around this particular character. I think it was really smart that she got out of her trap. After the radiation trap, this is when we get the Parker reveal. He turns on John and Amanda after saying that they're sick, that he doesn't believe in their games. And we get the reveal that actually he's the one that Cecilia called. He's her lover. He's been helping her. He's been working with her. He never had the surgery. He's just all part of the scam. It felt very obvious, but I wasn't mad at it. I wasn't, like, annoyed at the twist, because I'd rather have a twist that I see coming that makes sense than a twist that comes out of nowhere that doesn't make sense. Then Cecilia seems to get the upper hand on John and Amanda. We know that she can't have the upper hand for the whole film, because otherwise the rest of the movies wouldn't happen. We know where John and Amanda end up. So we know that she can't fully have the upper hand, but the movie does do a pretty good job of making it seem like John and Amanda are in real jeopardy at this point, that something has gone wrong and this wasn't quite part of the plan, because you do think for a moment, wait, how do they get out of this? Which I really enjoyed. It was a nice little surprise. I mean, like I say, you don't feel the, is John gonna die? Is Amanda gonna die? Because we know they don't, not yet. And it's at this point that, you know, Cecilia kills Gabriela, and it is just, it was such a sad moment in the cinema. You could feel everyone in the cinema around me was kind of like, just a big sigh, like, no. And I think what really sold that moment was Amanda's reaction, just being so viscerally hurt. Also, John being like, she won, actually, so she needs to go to a hospital. Like, just so deeply entrenched in his particular worldview that, she's redeemed now. No, she's been through her trial, as if he didn't put her through horrible torture. He's like, no, we need to get her to the hospital. You really do feel on Amanda and John's side fully again. Cecilia is just such a proper villain. We haven't had a proper villain that isn't a jigsaw killer. There aren't many, overtly good characters, even protagonists. We kind of have anti-heroes, or we get the big reveal at the end that they were terrible people all along, like Eric Matthews. But yeah, no, it's really interesting and fun and fresh to have a actual villain for John to go up against that seems somehow in the moment worse than he is. We start to get the idea of what's coming next, of how John and Amanda get out of this, because we get these little sneaky lines from John and Amanda that are foreshadowing the ending. We don't know that they're foreshadowing the ending, but again, just anyone who's seen a lot of the franchise would kind of know that these lines coming in at this point, they just seem a little bit sly, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, and you can kind of think like, yeah, no, okay, they've still got the upper hand here. And then they twist that away from you with Carlos, and they put the kid in the trap where it should be Amanda. Because it makes sense for me in John and Amanda's mind that they were like, yep, they'll put us in the trap and we can do the bloodboarding back and forth so that neither of us survive, and neither of us die. And we can do that as long as we need for them to feel like this is going to go on forever and they feel safe enough to go up into the gas room and have their final trap. I can see that logic, but then bringing in the kid is just a horrendous move from Cecilia, and it throws off John and Amanda. It's the first time someone, I think, really throws a thorn into one of Jigsaw's plans. You have this moment of selflessness from John as well, where he's, doesn't want the kid in the trap at all, but if he has to be in the trap, he's not going to let him suffer as much as he possibly can. The kid does get bloodboarded. That does happen for quite a while, and it's horrible to watch. It's really hard to watch a child in these traps. We've seen Daniel Matthews go through a trap, who's probably the youngest participant we've ever seen. Oh, and then there's the kid whose father was killed by William Easton by denying his health coverage. But we don't generally see many young people in traps, let alone an absolute child. And it feels like a very bold move from the franchise to do, but it does work. I think it works because of the context that it's done. We feel so bad for this kid, and I felt so much affection towards him when he pulled the lever to save John, even though I'm like, that's John, I shouldn't want him to survive. But this kid just being so selfless in that moment, it was a really beautiful emotional moment. Then Cecilia and Parker go up into the office room in search of the money that they think is there, and then dun 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 dun, twist reveal, this is what the plan was all along. This room is booby-trapped, and now toxic gas is filling it. You're going to fulfill the prophecy. Cecilia kills her partner, who they both said that they would, die for each other, that they'd do anything for each other, they love each other so much. And then as soon as the tables have turned on them, they immediately turn on each other. It reminds me of the Saw 2 gas house. It also reminds me a little bit of Saw 6's opener, the pound of flesh, with the, it's either you or it's me kind of feel to it. Cecilia has killed Parker, her head is sticking out of the gas room trap, and John and Amanda have released themselves from their collars and their chains, and we have them giving the money to Carlos for him and his family, then yes, walking out into the light. I thought it was really nice that they had this movie end with the door being opened when so many of the previous films have ended with a door being closed. It was just a really nice parallel. I really enjoyed it. Just when we think it's all over, we have the mid-credit scene where we have Henry, who was it seemed forgotten by the narrative. I was waiting for him to appear in the bit where all the scammers were being captured. I was waiting for Henry to be one of them. And when he wasn't, I was like, oh, okay, are we forgetting that character? Did he just fall off the face of the earth? What's going on? But no, we have got him back in the United States, back in the Saw bathroom. Just a nice little throwaway little, ta-da, of course we're back here, yay! And not only are they back in the Saw bathroom, not only are Zepp and Adam's bodies there, as they would have been at the end of, in that period of time briefly after Saw 1, but we also have Hoffman back. I actually was so happy to see him. I don't mind Hoffman as a character. I'm kind of ambivalent towards him. In some movies I really like him, in other movies I really don't. I think he's fantastic in Saw 5. I don't really rate him in, you know, Saw 6 and 7 so much. His character isn't as interesting to me. So I'm excited for what this means, that Costas Mandylor might be back in the franchise, or at least that they had him in this final credit scene. It feels like almost a tester for the audience. The production companies know that Amanda is popular. They know that Jigsaw is popular. Amanda was always the favourite apprentice, and some people like Hoffman a lot and some people really hate him. I think it was kind of a tester to see how audiences responded to a potential return of Costas Mandylor as Hoffman. Personally, I think it'd be great. I would love to see Hoffman come back. I would love to see more of that time period with Hoffman and Amanda together when they were both apprentices. I think that would be really interesting. It's a time period that was only fractionally explored. I think it's only in Saw 6 that we actually get to see them together. I would love it if this means that we might get that kind of trio of John and Amanda and Hoffman in Saw 11. So overall, things I really liked. I loved that this focused on John Kramer. I loved that it brought back Amanda, but no other major apprentice or person in John's life. I think it was nice just to keep it to that relationship is the one we're focusing on. I like the nods to Hoffman throughout though. It was a nice touch for die-hard fans, but they didn't make it overbearing, and then him appearing at the end was a really nice surprise. I really liked getting to know the trap participants beforehand, like properly fleshing them out, even if it is because they're all horrible people and doing bad things, but then we did have those nice little layers with them. I liked that even though it was a 4-scene ending, you know, we know that John and Amanda survive, and we know that this treatment doesn't work because John's cancer is still there in Saw 2 and 3. It's still tense. There were still lots of questions. It still makes sense. It's still very, very engaging as a story. That whole first hour especially is really engaging despite these foregone conclusions. And that just speaks to the writing. I also liked that they didn't de-age the characters. I know this is a kind of a point of contention. For some people it said it really took them out of the movie. I disagree. I really think that money can be better spent elsewhere. De-aging can look so awful. When I've seen it in other films, it often rubs me the wrong way. There's something uncanny about the way that the face looks, and I get distracted by that way more than just seeing someone who's naturally aged. I personally would much rather that we get a really, really gory trap effect, or that we film on location, than having de-aged characters. The traps and the gore in this were so good. It was so good. It was gritty, it was realistic, it was gratuitous, which was the problem that Jigsaw had for me, was that the traps were quite simple and then the gore was not gratuitous at all. No, not everyone wants gratuitous gore, but I do, and that's why I go see Saw film. I want gratuitous gore. I want it to be gross. I really liked that it was an actual villain for John to be up against. I thought that was really fresh. I liked that it was a contained story and you can enjoy it outside of seeing everything else in the franchise, or maybe just one other film. I also enjoyed that there was not a cop subplot. I'm really glad they didn't force that in. I mean, not only would it have made this movie way too long, I just think it makes sense not to have it here. This movie was much more emotional than I expected it to be. Tobin Bell acted his little socks off, and as I say, Shawnee Smith as well really delivered, and the little kid who played Carlos did a great job, and so did Gabriela. I've said before about the cinematography, the editing, the music. I think it just all felt very cohesive. It felt like a Saw film, and I loved that. It still felt true to the original. Again, it was one of the problems I had with Jigsaw, is it felt like it was trying to imply that the old editing choices or something were somewhat outdated, and they are, and they're cheesy, but it's part of it. So it felt like Jigsaw was trying to be like, oh, we're better than that now, and I just don't think it is. It's a Saw film. Be a Saw film. I also appreciated that they didn't go ham on the twists. We know that there's going to be a Saw twist, because every Saw movie has a twist. The twists, some of them you could see, some of them were a little less obvious, but in general, I think that the twists were done well, they were foreshadowed well. They were a little obvious, but not in a way that I found really annoying. Things that I was more mixed about, there are some logic gaps. There always are. It's a Saw film. It's a horror film. There are going to be logic gaps. You know, some people are saying, you know, where did John get all this equipment? How did John do this? He was on his deathbed. You know, how did he get things like Billy the Puppet across state lines? Even when they're making the movies, they have to buy him a plane ticket. There are ways around it, kind of, you know, if, you know, John was in this medical facility in the first place, he had a lot of toys to play with. He's an engineer. There might have been bits and pieces around that he could have used. Amanda could have brought some stuff. But if they'd over-explained the how, and forced that in as dialogue between characters, or made a real point of that exposition, I think it just would have been boring. I don't really care how. I just care that it happens. I was also mixed, as I said before, about John being deceived. I wasn't as miffed about him being deceived. It's just that because he is dying of cancer, you know, and he has a brain tumor of all things, it's very possible that his cognitive functions would have deteriorated, that he'd be so desperate for this hope that he just wants it to work. But then that kind of disappears a little bit because he's so smart at the end that he's outsmarting everyone. He's outsmarting Cecilia, who is one of his, you know, intellectual matches in terms of how villainous and how successful she's been in her villainy. And yeah, he still gets to one up her. But again, you could kind of argue that maybe he, you know, punished himself for that lapse in judgment in himself, and then really got his brain screwed on, and then he had all his apprentices that he got in touch with and spoke to and talked things through with. So again, I think you can get through that kind of lapse. John's ethos and moral code, I think you see it here well. We've seen before that John says things like, it should never be personal, you shouldn't do revenge. But then he's directly contradicted that in so many films before that it doesn't bother me that he contradicts it here, and this is a direct revenge plot. John's ethos has always been all over the shop, and I've always kind of got on board with the hypocrisy of the character, that he just, as long as he can self-justify it, that's all that matters to him, and that's all that really needs to matter to us. He's not a hero, he's a bad guy. So yeah, when people say that John's moral code is slightly corrupted by this one, show me a film where it isn't. Even the first one, it's corrupt. So there were some strange comments about Big Pharma in this, about the Peterson project, that being the original reason why it was shut down, was due to Big Pharma chasing after this man Peterson because he'd cured things, and they didn't want him to release these cures into the wild because then they would lose out on the money. It's not overly explored, it's just kind of there as a comment to show why John believes that this, you know, project has gone underground, and why it's gone underground, and why it's not legal to do. But I did think it was strange because there's been so many hints in the past about the corruption in the healthcare industry. We explore this in Saw 6. It just felt odd. I don't know. It was just the way it was brought up was just kind of in throwaway, and I was just like, oh, is this what this is about? No. Okay. All right then. Some people said that they felt that there were too few trap survivors in this, and I think that's not actually true. Diego survives his trap, Cecilia survives her trap, at least as far as we know, and Carlos survives the bloodboarding trap. Obviously the bloodboarding trap was never meant to kill anyone, but he does still survive it. It could kill someone. Gabriela does survive her trap, she just then dies later on in the film. I think it's just because Valentina and Mateo get so close to defeating the trap and winning that people go, oh, no one lived. But actually quite a few people made it out, and I did appreciate that pretty much every trap in this felt winnable. The only one really that you couldn't was the gas room trap, because it was it's you or it's me. I mean, I guess if the two of you were, you know, really in love, you'd maybe be like, right, I'll put my head out for 30 seconds and you hold your breath, and then I'll put my head out for 30 seconds and you hold your breath. Yeah, I don't know how long you can keep that up, but they don't do that. And it is very much framed as a one of you will die, and maybe that's as well to do with the way that the gas was affecting their skin, that eventually you'd bleed out, but then surely Cecilia would at the end as well. So is it unwinnable? I don't know. I was ambivalent about the dream sequence trap. I'm just not a huge fan of dream sequences in general in any movie, let alone a horror movie, unless it's, you know, thematically relevant to the story. I mean, for example, obviously dream sequences in like Nightmare on Elm Street makes sense. It's about dreams. If something's about someone losing their grip on reality, sure, yeah, dream sequences, because that's one of the ways that we can explore that thing. But when they just have it in a Saw film, what's the point? But it wasn't as annoying as it was in Saw 3D, and it meant that we got a trap sequence in that first 30 minutes of the film, which otherwise there wouldn't have been, and it did break up the pace maybe a little bit. Another thing that I think is interesting that I'm mixed about is, we've seen this before, the approach to addiction and the approach to sex work is complicated in the franchise. I think this is one of the better ones for addiction, because we see Amanda on the side of the person who is suffering from addiction, as whether before it's always, you know, John Kramer's vision of the world is, you know, if you're an addict or if you're a sex worker, that means you deserve to be put in a jigsaw trap alongside, you know, serial criminals and murderers and people who organize these scams or burn down a building that has 8 people living in it, and that's just as bad. Not sure about that, Jiggy man. But obviously, you know, we know his moral code is odd. He puts a smoker in a trap once. He has a wife and child tied up in the first movie and said to be killed if Lawrence Gordon doesn't kill Adam. I'm also ambivalent about the setting being in Mexico. I like that it was filmed in Mexico, if they were going to set it in Mexico. Logically, it just makes things a little bit more complicated. You know, John doesn't have his people around, John doesn't have his workshop around, but I do think that it contributes to the feeling of isolation that John has at the beginning of the film, and that kind of desolation as he realizes that everything's been a scam. He really feels very alone. So that kind of makes sense, and pulling him out of his comfort zone. So I do think there were aspects of it that worked. I won't forgive for the Mexico storyline is the yellow filter. You filmed it in Mexico, so, you know, just have the shot. The cinematography is so gorgeous. You don't need that "we're in Mexico" yellow filter on. There are very few things that I actually actively didn't like, but one of them is that final trap. I loved the twist reveal of it, even though I knew that there was going to be some way that John and Amanda got out of this. I didn't see it playing out exactly in the way that it did, and then I think it was quite poetic the way that it was done, with Parker being killed by Cecilia and then her winning the trap. But the trap itself was just a bit after so many great traps before it, and it just felt like the character who most deserved to go through a jigsaw trap, if anyone deserves to go through a jigsaw trap, it's this woman. It just felt a bit anticlimactic right at the end, and I was a little bit sad, especially since Cecilia lives, but then we just see her head sticking out, and then what's happening to her skin? Is her skin just going to rot away? Is she going to die? Is she going to live? Is she going to just rot there? Is she going to get found? I don't know. I mean, maybe it depends what they do with her later, but then I'm not really sure I want another movie with her, because it kind of feels like it's wrapped up. My last complaint is probably going to be the most controversial, but the inclusion of the cassette tapes and of Billy the Puppet felt really forced. I know why they're there, and I know I've been saying this entire time how I love all the little homages to the original. I love how it's not trying to not be the original. Billy the Puppet is part of that. Cassette tapes are part of that. But because we have John and Amanda in the room and they're directly engaging with the participants, it just felt unnecessary to have both. It would have made sense to me if, you know, once John and Amanda put people in the traps, they were just behind the screen, and maybe it was, you know, two-way glass or darkened or whatever, and they were watching and reacting and engaging with it in that way, but they didn't actually have an engagement with the participants. Then the cassette tapes and Billy make sense. But I do think it would have been a loss not to have those interactions of Amanda with the players in the game. So that's the whole movie. That's everything I liked and didn't like, and I've talked a really long time. I love Saw, can you tell? How do I feel about it as a film in its own right? Really good, actually. I think in terms of filmmaking, the actual, you know, look and feel of it, the script work, the cinematography, the directing, this might be the best one. Budget helps, because what, you know, they did with Saw 1 and Saw 2, which are my favourites, was so impressive considering how little they had to work with in terms of money. So their filmmaking is impressive in a different way, almost, because this one had the money behind it, had the studio support behind it. So I think this might be the best film of the bunch in terms of that, the quality of the filmmaking. How do I feel about this as a Saw film overall? Love it. It's great. I really enjoyed it. It's awesome. I am so glad it was made. If I was going to rank this in terms of the entire franchise as a whole, this goes straight in at number 3, right behind the original 2. So like I say, Saw 2 is my favourite, then the original, this comes in at a strong third, and I was not expecting Saw 10 to break the top 3, but it absolutely does. It's a fantastic entry. I'm really happy with it. I can't wait to rewatch it. I think I'd even happily go and pay to see it again in the cinema because it's that good. And I'm really hopeful for the first time for the next one. Like, really hopeful. If they've cracked it with this one like I think they have, then we could be on for an absolute treat with Saw 11. Who would have thought it? Smashing. So that's my review of Saw X. I plan on making a lot more videos, definitely some more Saw videos. I'd love to rank the rest of the series. I'd love to do some discussion and analysis on the rest of the series. So as for now, thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.